Good day everyone, this is the group Hydro, and we are here today to present to you the life below water and its use from human activities. So as we all know, water never leaves the earth. It is always everywhere. It is constantly cycling through the atmosphere, the ocean, and the land. The sun's energy causes this process, which is called the water cycle. So to further discuss the water cycle, let me share with you first the definition of biogeochemical cycle. So biogeochemical cycle is defined as the flow of chemical elements between living organisms and the environment. It helps explain how the planet conserves matter and uses energy. The cycles move elements through ecosystems so the transformation of things can happen. They are also important because they store elements and recycle them. The four major biogeochemical cycles are namely water or hydrological cycle, carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, and oxygen cycle. So, moving forward, the water cycle is defined as the continuous movement of water within the earth and atmosphere. So the water cycle shows the continuous movement of the water within the earth and atmosphere, and it is a complex system that includes many different processes. Liquid water evaporates into water vapor, condenses to form clouds, and precipitates back to earth in the form of rain and snow. So for you to have a better visualization of the water cycle, let me show you the visuals. So for us to have a better understanding, may I call on Ms. Tan to discuss the effects of human activities on the water cycle.
Anthropogenic effects of the water cycle. The word anthropo is a Greek word that means having to do with humanity, and genic means creation. Scientists use the word anthropogenic in referring to environmental change caused or influenced by people either directly or indirectly. Human activities has a large impact on the global water cycle. Through the building of dams and irrigation schemes, large amounts of water are diverted from river systems. Though the emission of greenhouse gases causing global warming, also the rainfall and evaporation patterns are changed across the globe. Greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect is a natural phenomenon of Earth's atmosphere, trapping a range of gases, which in turn capture infrared radiation to keep our Earth at a moderate temperature range, compared to other planets in our solar system. Human activities such as burning of fossil fuels has an effect on the overall increase of the Earth's temperature. Raising the Earth's temperature means that there is an increase of evaporation, melting of land and sea ice, and impacts on other processes of the water cycle that adversely affect the climate of the Earth. The water cycle is the process by which water circulates around the Earth. It is also important because of the role water plays in our biological processes, climate, and other elemental cycles. Fresh water is finite and limited resource on the Earth, and increasingly much of it is polluted by both pathogenic microbes and chemical contaminants. Human demand for fresh water is increasing. In particular, water is required to irrigate crops to feed the rapidly increasing human population. This is why we should be responsible and be mindful of our effects in the environment.
Next is the invasive species below water. So invasive, non-native species of plants, animals, and disease organisms adversely affect the ecosystems they enter. Like biological wildfires, they can quickly spread and affect nearly all terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. Moving on to the invasive aquatic species. First one we have is the green crab. It's a voracious eater and poses a nuisance to shellfish farmers. The next one is the killer algae. It's a green seaweed native to the Indian that has spread in the Mediterranean, replacing native plants and depriving marine life of food and habitat. And the last example is the sea walnut. It contributed to the collapse of local fisheries because they feed on zooplankton that the commercial fish also consumes. Moving on to the effects of invasive species below water. First one is displaced native species. Another is the degrade of the native habitat. Next is it spread diseases. And last but not the least, it disrupts the human socio-economic life. That's all for the invasive species below water.
Epigenetics is the study of how behaviors and environment can cause changes that affect the way your genes work. Unlike genetic changes, epigenetic changes are reversible and do not change your DNA sequence, but they can change how your body reads a DNA sequence. So how does epigenetic work? Epigenetic changes affect gene expression in different ways, and there are three types of epigenetic changes, and these are the DNA methylation, histone modification, and lastly, non-coding RNA. For the DNA methylation works by adding a chemical group to DNA. Typically, this group is added to specific places on the DNA, where it blocks the proteins that attach to the DNA to read the gene. The chemical group can be removed through a process called demethylation. Typically, methylation turns genes off and demethylation turns genes on. For the histone modification, as shown in the figure, DNA wraps around proteins called histones. The DNA wrapped tightly around histones cannot be accessed by proteins that read the genes. Some genes are wrapped around histones and are turned off, while some genes are not wrapped around histones and are turned on. Chemical groups can be added or removed from histones and change whether a gene is unwrapped or wrapped on or off. And lastly, in non-coding RNA, your DNA is used as instructions for making coding and non-coding RNA, as shown in the figure. Coding RNA is used to make proteins, and non-coding RNA helps control genes expression by attaching to coding RNA, along with the certain proteins to break down the coding RNA so that it cannot be used to make proteins. Non-coding RNA may also recruit proteins to modify histones to turn genes on or off.
To conclude our presentation, water cycle is the process wherein it is the constant movement of water. This is where changing the state of matter happens. This simple process has immense benefit to all life on Earth. Without water cycle, the living things such as humans, animals, plants would not have the access to water that generally provides these living organisms the hydration and food that they need. This reliance on the water cycle makes this type of process essential to be able to meet human needs. As the human population grows, these needs also grows over time as well, and clearly later on create an anthropogenic impact to the environment that leads to exploitation of the environment in order to harvest its natural resources. Regarding its destructive effects, it can have negative impacts not only to human beings but also to certain pieces of the environment. And that is all for our presentation. Thank you for listening.